The spaces in which games are played are a fascinating and important part of play. After all, without a play space, a game can be little more than an unusable set of rules and systems. With this in mind, game developers take great care when crafting their virtual spaces, as a level's design can have just as much of an impact on the experience of play as any systemic changes. The landscape of synthetic locales is unfathomably varied. Games have everything from mysterious, expansive plateaus ripe for exploration, to winding, interconnected arenas built for multiplayer battle, to bizarre, surrealist dreamscapes with perplexing qualities. However, amongst all these varied virtual vistas, there is one game that I feel has an incredibly fascinating and compelling set of virtual spaces with aspects that little else in this expansive industry has even attempted to emulate. Since you have read the title of this video, you know that this game is Garry's Mod, which is colloquially abbreviated to Gmod. To me, there is something extremely compelling about how Gmod's virtual spaces are contextualized to create compelling and emergent social gameplay. But in order to fully understand the levels of Gmod, we first need to understand the nature of space in games. Spaces in video games are artificial structures built to contain play. The methods of a level's construction may differ wildly, with some being built by procedural algorithms, and others being meticulously handcrafted by developers. But all virtual levels are artificial structures within which the game is contained. The role that space has in the play of games is special. In fact, it could be argued that spaces in games have a sacred quality to them, and this quality is essential for play, at least according to Dutch historian Johan Huizinga. In his book Homo Ludens, Huizinga highlights how, by definition, play is distinct from the so-called ordinary world, and is instead relegated to a specific time, and more importantly for this video, place. The basketball court, for instance, very clearly delineates what physical space is and is not a part of a game. Huizinga describes how these spaces can be set apart as sacred for the purposes of play. As he explains, the arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc., are all in form and function playgrounds, i.e. forbidden spots isolated, hedged round, hallowed, within which special rules obtain. Just like how certain gestures or symbols gain special meaning in certain places, in these spaces of play and ritual, there exist meanings that can only be found within these consecrated spots. Inside a boxing ring, a punch carries a significantly different meaning than a punch thrown outside of that special space set aside for sport. Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman would later expand on Huizinga's work with a concept that they refer to as the magic circle, which is the idea that within a game there are special meanings and that by choosing to play a game, players enter a magic circle, adopting a set of stated and assumed rules and social guidelines. Within this space, there are special rules that normally don't apply to reality, and on the surface seem quite absurd. It is within this space that we find games. Before on this channel, I have talked about the magic circle as a primarily abstract concept, but I think it is important to remember that it can also be a very physical phenomenon as well, where the very real entry of a space, either virtual or analog, imparts on its players a changed state of mind and conceptualization of one's self. So, games take place in artificial spaces, set apart to contain the special meaning of play, but space in and of itself is not a game. Instead, games are inherently systems of rules. Without the rules, a golf course is just a patch of grass with some really bizarre landscaping. Rules are an extremely foundational element of games, and many games writers have picked up on this and noted the importance of rules in their definitions of games. As Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman explain in The Rules of Play, rules provide the structure out of which play emerges, by delimiting what the player can and cannot do. Essentially, rules are a guide for what actions are or are not possible in any given game. Even games that don't appear to have rules still have them to some extent. At first glance, Yume Nikki appears to be a game simply about exploring surrealist landscapes with very little systemic interaction between the player and the world around them. However, even this game is governed by rules that define how the player moves through space. The player can move in the 4 cardinal directions, they can't move through walls, and they can interact with certain objects to move to new areas. In keeping with Salen and Zimmerman's description of rules, these are guidelines that clearly delineate how the player can and can't interact with the world around them. So, both a spatial element of some sort and rules are prominent elements of games. In fact, both the space of play and the rules interact with one another and change how a game feels to play. With this in mind, most developers design their virtual spaces with a very specific rule set in mind, so as to ensure that both elements harmoniously work together. And this is a great thing. Having spaces that are precise constructions to harmoniously facilitate a game's rule set can lead to extremely compelling experiences where the rules and space feed into each other because of their precisely designed relationship. There are many good reasons why most of the industry does this. However, this is where we return to Gmod, because Gmod is not like most of the industry. For those of you who might not be familiar with Gmod, it is a source engine sandbox game that is primarily driven by community-created content. The default Garry's Mod experience is actually quite barren, with 2 expansive maps primarily built to facilitate construction projects. The true Gmod experience begins once players start diving into the Steam Workshop, where players can download all sorts of models, weapons, vehicles, scripts, player models, and much more. However, on the workshop, people can also upload custom maps and game modes, and these are what I want to focus on today. Gmod maps are exactly what you would think they are, custom levels that are the space where games are played. Game modes are the player-created sets of rules that define what players can and can't do in any given session of Gmod. For instance, the basic sandbox game mode lets players spawn in whatever they want and mess around in a freeform manner. Murder is more of a goal-oriented game mode, where one player is the murderer, and they have to kill everyone else before the detective figures out who they are and kills them. Aside from these, you have games like Hide and Seek, or Who Touched It Last, which is a sort of combination of dodgeball and hot potato. Or you have the MLG crossbow game, which is exactly what you would expect from something calling itself the MLG crossbow game.
I'm kind of concerned on why you're good at this.
This isn't even getting into the roleplay game modes, which are just rule sets that help people get together and roleplay in a variety of different settings. When playing Gmod, the map selection process is entirely separate from the selection of what game mode is being used, and this has some interesting effects on how Gmod is played. When playing the same map under different rule sets, players begin to understand how the rules completely recontextualize how players visualize the space in which they play. For example, when playing Murder on the small map, players are thinking about the space in terms of how they can avoid being murdered, or if they're the murderer, they're thinking about the best way to pick off a scattered group of people running around the mall's many rooms. However, when playing Who Touched It Last, players think about this same space in terms of sightlines and where they can evade the dreaded dodgeball of death. Alternatively, when playing Hide and Seek, players are primarily concerned with where on the map they can be the most concealed. Each game mode prioritizes different aspects of the level, casting it in all sorts of new lights. This casting of levels in new systemic lights reveals different aspects of the level and encourages novel approaches to gameplay, giving players a chance to understand the virtual space in a more holistic manner. Space will always have some relation to the rules that govern how it can be utilized. In most games, you can only experience their spaces under a very limited and curated set of rules. Essentially, developers give the player a hammer and fill the world with tons of fun nails that are suited for that hammer. Gmod, on the other hand, just gives the player the entire toolbox and tells the player to go nuts, building whatever they please. Gmod highlights the versatility of space, where even if a space wasn't explicitly designed for play, it could be appropriated for merrymaking of all sorts, and I think there is something beautiful about that. In a way, Gmod levels actually remind me of real-life analog space. When I was younger, I would spend a lot of time hanging out with my extended family on our grandparents' farm. One of our favorite things to do was to play games of all sorts on this farm. Just like the Gmod levels I mentioned earlier, the farm was not built with a specific set of rules in mind, or even play for that matter. Quite the opposite, in fact. This farm was built with practicality and efficiency in mind, perfectly designed to maximize its agricultural output. However, that didn't stop me and my cousins from appropriating and recontextualizing this space for all sorts of games. We would play tag, hide and seek, kickball, hide and seek tag, and all sorts of other games, and it was fun enough to keep us occupied for hours. There is something special about this place that is only truly understood by the handful of us who spent our youth playing here. I am willing to bet that many of my viewers have their own metaphorical grandparents' farm, where they spent time with friends and family playing in whatever spaces you had available. Perhaps it was a backyard, a local park, a school playground, a wooded forest, some space that you found and appropriated for games. Shakespeare once said, "All the world's a stage," but perhaps all the world is a playground, as long as you're willing to enter that sacred magic circle. That magic circle needs not to be confined to the places explicitly built for play, for it can exist anywhere people decide it should exist. Gmod channels this attitude of appropriating spaces for games into the virtual world. There are a wide variety of maps that are designed like real places. In Gmod, you can find 7-Elevens, museums, churches, city skylines, and an endless deluge of modern apartment complexes. There are even several maps that are based on real places, such as renowned architect Frank Lloyd Wright's famous Falling Water House. Even the International Space Station makes an appearance in Gmod. All of these maps were designed, first and foremost, to evoke very real places, leading to a style of map that feels very close to what I felt playing on my grandparents' farm. While these sorts of maps are based more in reality, because Gmod is a digital program, it isn't constrained to reality, and many mappers use this to their advantage, creating all sorts of bizarrely surreal and abstract levels.
We're all here.
Yep.
Should we all be Kleiner? Should I change?
Oh!
No!
While these levels discard any notion of realism, I feel they are capable of evoking that grandparents' farm sort of feel, because that feeling isn't necessarily contingent on a space feeling real. Rather, this feeling is evoked by places that have been built for some non-play purpose, but have been appropriated for ludic ritual. There are spaces that, instead of asking, "What game do I want to play?" and then serve me a virtual space that is associated with that specific game, they instead get me to ask, "What sort of games do I want to play here?" As if the space I inhabit is the lens through which I decide what game I want to play. To me, there is something very empowering and creative about those sorts of spaces. When I play any other game, I can only do whatever the developers want me to do, and I can only do it in the way that they want me to do it. But in Gmod, the power is given to the player. Whenever I find a space in Gmod, I can do whatever I want in it. I get to decide what sorts of games I want to play here. Sure, the map designer created this vaporwave map for Trouble in Terrorist Town, but its initial conception is more of a guideline than an actual rule. Even though it was made for Trouble in Terrorist Town, it's incredibly fun to play murder here, so that's what I play. In Gmod, the designer is not responsible for dictating the play that can exist in their levels. That responsibility falls on the player's shoulders, in a way that is reminiscent of a group of cousins sitting around their grandparents' farm debating if they should play hide-and-seek or tag. Gmod allows us to recontextualize space for whatever play we would desire, just as we do in the real world, and it's only able to do so because it doesn't rigidly dictate what ludic rules can exist in its sacred spaces. Additionally, I want to address the multitude of Gmod levels that are ripped from other games and brought straight into Gmod. Scrolling through the Steam Workshop, one can find famous gaming locales such as Woohoo Island, Luigi's Mansion, Lavender Town, Owl's Toy Barn, Outset Island, Onet, Dust 2, Womp's Fortress, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, Delfino Airstrip, The Artisan's Home, Blood Gulch, the Metaton Hotel, and many more. Where someone else might see lazy and shameless copyright infringement, I see something a bit more interesting. Each of the levels I listed before were created to cater to a very specific ludic context, which they are all chained to in their original games. However, when brought into Gmod, these spaces lose their original meanings and are appropriated into the player-empowering free-play context I mentioned earlier. If anything, Gmod just goes to show how versatile these spaces can be if removed from their original gameplay contexts, and how this versatility can lend itself to a freeform play that empowers the player to ludically explore a space however they see fit. One of my favorite examples of Gmod being used to appropriate and repurpose a space is Half-Life VR, but the AI is self-aware. For those of you who might not be familiar with this project, Half-Life VR but the AI is Self-Aware is a web series directed by YouTuber Wayne Radio TV, where he and a bunch of friends each play various Half-Life 1 characters, trying to escape the resonance cascade. While the series looks mostly indistinguishable from the original game, the entire series was filmed in Gmod. Instead of playing through the game normally, the cast of the series used Black Mesa as an excuse for improv comedy that plays off the structure of the facility and the entities found within.
Oh my god!
Oh my god, what is that?
Oh nice, look at that.
I've never seen something like that. There's no article about that on Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia.
The free online encyclopedia that can edit?
I just think it's cool that a space meant for compelling gunplay could be appropriated for the purposes of comedy, and this is only possible because of the freedom Gmod provides. The role of space in play is incredibly important, but is rarely able to be explored without the contextual lens of the rules imposed upon them. While the player still has to contend with the presence of rules in Gmod, its focus on player-created content leads to an empowering form of play, where players utilize virtual space in a manner reminiscent of how, in the analog world, spaces are appropriated to become sacred spaces of play, regardless of if those spaces were intended for games. Even amongst other games focused on player-created content, I've never played as interesting of an example of a game that has a plethora of maps and game modes, each of which are developed independently and with little consideration of each other. Gmod's levels are incredibly fascinating. Sure, at times they might be a bit uncanny, weird, perhaps a bit unrefined, but I wouldn't have them any other way. The world in which we live is bizarre. My grandparents' farm probably wasn't the most tightly honed and optimal place in which to play tag, but its quirky idiosyncrasies flavored the course of our play, in a way I could never get from an optimally designed tag arena. Perhaps perfection can be designed through the meticulous refinement of a space, perfectly honed to a given set of rules. But perhaps perfection can be stumbled into, where unknowingly, the most perfect playgrounds exist in the mundane places of the world. It only takes someone playful enough to see it. Play is powerfully emergent, where a simple set of rules and a neat level can spiral into a dazzling array of possibility. There is nothing else like Gmod, and hopefully I've convinced people that Gmod is more than the haha funny weird meme game that many people consider it to be. It's a sacred haven of play that lays bare the intricacies of how space, rules, and the players harmoniously feed into and react to one another to create an incredibly profound experience of ritualistic play. Thank you for getting to the end of my video. So, I just wanted to say a few things. Firstly, if Gmod interests you and you're interested in checking out the maps I used in this video, don't worry. I've created a collection of all the maps and game modes that I show in the video, along with some other maps that I throw in for good measure. Exploring all that Gmod has to offer has been an incredibly fun experience, and these maps are a huge part of why I love this game. Secondly, I just wanted to mention my Patreon. These videos take a lot of time and work for me to finish, and if you enjoy what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon. Anyway, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.